one or two other staff on a trip into the Alto Beni, as it was called. This is on the down over the eastern slopes of the Andes Mountains into the headwaters of the Amazon River. So we came down out of the mountains, and then there's this big grassy jungly plain, and it had towns scattered around it, but not connected by road. You got there by plane, by horse, or by boat in the rainy season when the river was high enough. And this was a trip to determine whether or not we wanted to put Peace Corps volunteers out there. So I'm brand new, and I get somehow the flip of the coin ended up with me going rather than Ron. There were, altogether with the pilot, once we got to the private plane, there were 5 of us in a Cessna. So we had to leave from La Paz and go to Cochabamba, where we got rid of, no, it wasn't Cochabamba, we flew to Tarija in a DC-3. Tarija was the first major town out in this low area. And from there, they'd made arrangements for us to fly by private craft, visiting 4 or 5 towns. This was my first big adventure, of course. Wearing new work boots, brand spanking new, not a scratch on them. I was obviously the tenderfoot. And I was the one that sort of sat in the back of the plane. We took off and flew around these places, and typically these were meat-raising towns. They had cows, and at the runways were dirt or gravel. At the end of each runway was a primitive slaughterhouse. And the major business was beef, and it was beef being flown out of there in old B-17 bombers. That's where they ended up after World War II. Because they had a heavy lift capacity and could get to high enough altitudes to get to La Paz easily. It was a good aircraft for that. So they would slaughter these cows, quarter them, and then just throw the pieces into the back of the plane, cover it with a net, take off, and fly to La Paz. Ron actually flew in one of those. I never did. And he has some great stories about that. But when you came over these towns, then you could see the runway, you could see the building at the end that was the slaughterhouse. And as you looked, you could see the way the town's laid out. There were roads leading out of town, but as you watched, those roads just sort of disappeared into the grassland. They didn't connect these towns. And there were cattle farms out there. So to land, you'd come in, you'd buzz the runway to shoo any cows off who might be there. So you'd circle around to be sure the pilot was sure that the runway was clear, and then he'd land. So we land in these places, and then if there was a taxi cab, usually there wasn't, but there might be a little truck, or in one case it was a Jeep, a U.S. Army Jeep from World War II, surplus there. I remember very succinctly us dropping our baggage in the Jeep and then sitting around it. You know, you could put a driver and 5 people in a Jeep if you were careful about how you sat around the edges and so on. This guy starts the Jeep and he's driving very slowly into town, and I wasn't sure why that was until we come into town and we're in the middle of a block and he starts turning the steering wheel. Nothing happened. I counted it. He made 5.5 revolutions of the steering wheel before it caught, and it caught right at the right time as we made a right-hand turn. Then he rapidly spins it back until it catches again and he straightens it out. So we're down the street, and it's like being in an old west town. There are adobe buildings with wooden walkways, dirt streets, and on the side of each street is sort of a depression, like a ditch that's been rounded off to catch water when it rains, take it away. So we see this little two-story building coming up, says a sign out front, says hotel. That's where we're going, and as we get there, he slows down, he drops it into first gear, moving ever more slowly. And as we get in front of the hotel, he steers it down into the depression. And as it comes up the other side, he stalls it out. I realize he has no brakes. So he stalls it out, and the engine compression held it there. I said, that's interesting. We unloaded, went into the hotel, had a meal in the hotel, went to bed. I happened to have a room that was at the front of the hotel. There were sort of like bunk beds, very thin mattresses and mosquito netting. So after dinner, been a long day of traveling, we were all tired, we went to bed. And I was awakened by a lot of noise and a lot of lights sort of moving in and out of the windows.